Hi everyone, welcome to the first lecture of Unit 2. Here we are at Chapter 3. I like to say this is the chapter where the actual biology begins. Even though everything we've done so far does relate to biology, we are now diving into living things and we'll focus on those living things and how they work for the rest of the semester. We're starting small and we will work our way upward through the rest of this semester and in through Bio 139. And remember from our very first lecture of the semester, the smallest unit of life are the cells, and this is where life first begins. So the next few lectures, we're going to look at what cells are and how they work, starting with Chapter 3, which I think is about 4 or 5 lectures long. And then we will have another couple of lectures where we look at metabolism and how cells produce energy. So first, before we actually dive into the material, let's take a look at what we're looking at here and see some of the different shapes that cells come in, because they can have a variety of different looks. Up here in the top right, by now you've probably already had the lab that looks at cells and you make your own slide with cheek cells. Well, these are some cheek cells. They're my cheek cells that I took a photo of during one of our lab meetings. Down here in the bottom right, these are called erythrocytes, or more commonly called red blood cells. These are the cells that carry oxygen through our body. They are among the smallest cells in the body. If you're a female, these are the smallest cells in your body. Here in the bottom middle, we have both the smallest human cell and the largest human cell in one photo. These small little tadpole-looking cells, these are sperm. They are the smallest cells that humans produce. This big round structure is the egg, and it is the largest cell that humans produce, and it is the only cell in the body that can be seen with the naked eye. It's really, really small, but it is large enough to be seen with the naked eye. Here in the bottom left, this is a neuron, a nerve cell. We'll spend a chapter looking at those and how they work near the end of the semester. And up here in the top left, these are called ear hair cells, which sounds kind of gross, but they're not really what they sound like. These are not the cells that are ear hairs like we see sometimes in old men sticking out like little bushes. That's not what these are. Ear hair cells aren't really hair at all. They are cells that have little projections that are used in hearing. So they're kind of epithelial cells and they're kind of nerve cells. They kind of cross and interconnect there. But these are structures that help us to hear. But none of that is what we're looking at in this chapter. This is just to give you an idea of the various ways that cells can appear. And there's actually way more than this. This is just a sampling to show you how diverse they can be. Now, to start, here are our not really attendance questions. And even though we're taking this after we have our first lecture exam and Unit 1 is behind us, remember, everything in this class builds on previous material. So that material that we learned in Unit 1, we're not done with it. It is extremely important to go back and review it regularly, because not only will it come up on every exam and the final exam, all of our material that we learn will come from that pre-existing material. So these are important questions to think about. Do I remember this older material? First, what does polar molecule mean? And next, describe the polarity of a phospholipid. And go ahead and pause the video try to answer those. Now, hopefully you've done that, and hopefully you were able to either answer these correctly or at least get close because the words sound familiar. If they don't sound familiar, please go back and review. Both of these come from near the end of chapter 2. So these are chemistry-related questions. Polar, well, remember the word polar in general just means two areas are different from each other. They have different properties. So if we're talking polar molecules, it means there's a molecule where some areas of that molecule may have one property and other areas may have another property. The example that we used over and over there was water. We said that the oxygen side of water and the hydrogen side of water were different. The oxygen side had a little bit of a negative charge, and the hydrogen side had a little bit of a positive charge. So the two sides had different properties. They were a little bit different from each other. Well, then we went on and talked about phospholipids. Phospholipids are going to be really, really important in the chapter 3 lectures. We'll talk about them in, I believe, every single lecture that we have. So think back to the end of chapter 2 when we were talking about lipids and we got to phospholipids. We said phospholipids had polarity. We had a phosphate head group and a lipid tail group. So the lipids, since they are fats, they are non-polar. The phosphate head group was polar. So not only is the head group polar and has some properties throughout it, the whole molecule is polar, because the head group has one set of properties and the tail groups have another set of properties. We will look at that here in more detail in the next couple of slides. But the fact that phospholipids are polar molecules, it's going to give cell membranes and cells in general very special properties that are very important for allowing cells to do the things that cells need to do to keep us alive. So let's start talking about cells. All right, cells are what we are made of. Cells are actually what all living things are made of. We say cells are the building blocks of all life. There is no living thing that is not made of cells. Some living things are really, really small, and they are only made of one cells. Some living things are really, really big, and they're made of a lot of cells. But if they are living, they are made of cells. And when we're learning about cells, there are certain properties that hold true, and we group those together in something called cell theory. Theory is a word that gets misused a lot. I like to say one way that you can anger a scientist with only 5 words is to say, oh, it's just a theory. Because what that tells a scientist is the person who said it has no idea what the word theory means. A theory is not something that we are guessing at. That's a hypothesis. To say, oh, that's just a hypothesis, absolutely, go for it. That's the way to use it. But a theory is something that has been put to a test many, many times and has always been found to be true. Gravity is a theory. Germs cause disease is a theory. All living things are made of cells is a theory. They've all been put to the test, and they've all passed the test every single time. So, cell theory is what we're going to talk about to begin with, and it has a few things. One of the most important things that cell theory says is all living things are composed of cells. If you find something and you don't know what it is and you're wondering if it's alive, One thing to do is look at it under a really strong microscope, and if you see cells, yep, it's alive. If you see no cells, nope, it's not alive. Those are the only two options. Next part of cell theory is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. That means when you have a baby, that baby did not spontaneously generate. It came from sperm and egg. It came from pre-existing cells. When any living thing comes into existence, it did not spontaneously generate. It came from pre-existing cells. Bacteria do not have sexual reproduction. Well, sometimes they do, but not always. Instead, what they do is one cell splits into two cells. But those two cells came from a pre-existing cell. So whether something reproduces sexually or not, the cells in it came from pre-existing cells. That's the other part of cell theory. Now, cells, we said, are really small. Some of them are much bigger than others. Some of them are much smaller than others. But they are all really small. With very few exceptions, cells are microscopic. You cannot see them with the naked eye. How small are they? Well, the average human is made of somewhere between 50 and 100 trillion cells. Most of us accept that 100 trillion cells is in the typical human body. That is not 100,000. That is not 100 million. That is not 100 billion. 100 trillion cells make up the human body. And as if that is not mind-blowing enough, because 100 trillion is a mind-boggling number. But of those 100 trillion cells in your body, only 1 out of every 10 are human. Let that sink in for a moment. You have 100 trillion cells in your body, and only 10 trillion of them are human. The other 90 trillion cells are not human. They are something like bacteria. They are something like fungi. They are non-human cells. That means if we put you into a blender and broke you down into cells and separated them out, you are way more not you than you. Your body belongs more to somebody else or something else than it does to you. The number of bacteria and fungi that make up your body, or little insects or other little critters that live in and on your body, they're beneficial for the most part. Without them, you would not be able to live very long. They keep you healthy, but they're not you. You are more not you than you. All right, so now that we got that fun thing to think about when you're going to bed tonight, keep that in your mind. You got little critters crawling all over your face that are there to keep you clean and happy. Let's instead back up and look at cells in general. And what we see here is what we call the general cell, or the generalized cell, or the typical cell. The vast majority of cells in your body do not look like this. This is a generic cell that is just there to show you the parts that cells have. Cells have these parts, and this is a generic way of showing you all of those parts. And when we look at a cell, we think of 2 or 3 regions that everything falls into. First, the outside part of the cell is called the plasma membrane. Sometimes you will also hear it called the cell membrane. It's kind of like the outer border or the outer wall of the cell. It is not okay to call it the cell wall. Cell wall is something that plants and fungi have, but animal cells, including humans, do not have a cell wall. It is a wall. It is the edge of the cell. It is the border of the cell, but it is called either the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. And it is there to hold the things that belong inside the cell in and keep the things that belong outside the cell out. Both of those are extremely important. Keep the inside stuff in, keep the outside stuff out. If the inside leaks out, that's bad. If the outside stuff leaks in, that's bad. We need the plasma membrane to keep everything where it belongs. So now we look at the inside of the cell, and collectively, the inside of the cell is called the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is the contents of the cell. It's what is inside of a cell. But we can be a little bit more specific. We could break the cytoplasm down into parts. There is the kind of jelly-like liquid called the cytosol. Cytosol is the jelly-like liquid part of the cytoplasm. But then we have these kind of structures, these bits and pieces of things. And these are called organelles. That word literally means little organs. And that's what we could think of. When we think of our own organs, we may think of something like the stomach, the lungs, the brain. Well, that's what organelles are. They're kind of like the lungs, the stomach, the brain of the cell. Each of them is a discrete unit. Here we see a mitochondrion. Here we see another mitochondrion. Here we see something called the Golgi apparatus and the rough endoplasmic reticulum, smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Those are each an organelle. And they each have a very specific function that we will look at in the next few lectures. So cytoplasm is made of cytosol, the liquid, and organelles, the bits and pieces. And lastly, the nucleus. Some sources will say the nucleus is an organelle. Some will say it is a part of the cytoplasm because it is an organelle. Some sources just say it's a third part of the generalized cell. There's the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus. I'm not going to say one way or the other. Personally, I include nucleus as an organelle. It is a part of the cytoplasm. I will not ask you, is the nucleus a part of the cytoplasm? Is it an organelle? Because that's not important. What is important is what does the nucleus do, and we will learn that in a future lecture. So just know all of these parts are parts of a cell. But what we're going to look at today is what's outside of the cell and the cell membrane, the plasma membrane. So before we talk about the cell, let's talk about what's going on outside the cell. Now, as a general rule, the cells in our body are connected to the other cells in our body. They bump up against each other. But even though they bump up against each other, there is some stuff outside of and between those cells. And there's different stuff outside of and between those cells. There are body fluids, also called extracellular fluids. Extracellular fluids, or ECF, are fluids in our body that are inside the body, but outside the cell. The most common one is blood plasma, the liquid part of blood. That is extracellular fluid. And the extracellular fluid, like I said, it's inside the body, but outside the cells. Next, cellular secretions. These are things that start out inside the cell, but the cells secrete them for a specific purpose. Cells are always secreting things. In the stomach and in the intestines and in some of our glands along the digestive tract, we have cells that secrete digestive fluids and enzymes that help break down our food. In places like our respiratory tract or the upper part of our digestive tract, we have cells that secrete lubrication, something like mucus. Those are cellular secretions. Next, the extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix is something that's found outside of and between practically every cell in our body, but in some places it's a lot more extensive. It is a jelly-like fluid that's got a lot of proteins and a lot of carbohydrates in them. It makes it very thick. And we will look at that later when we get to connective tissues like the skeletal system, where this is going to be very important. In some tissues, there's really extensive stuff outside the cells. In some tissues, there's very, very little outside the cells. But there's always going to be something outside of the cells. But we're here to talk about the cells. That's the purpose of chapter 3. And we're going to spend the rest of this lecture talking about the plasma membrane, the cell membrane. And that's what we see here. Here is our generalized cell, and we are wanting to look more closely at the plasma membrane. So this little square right here, we've taken it, we've blown it up, and that's what we see right here. This is a small portion of the plasma membrane. Down here, this is the inside of the cell. Up here, this is the outside of the cell. And the plasma membrane divides the inside from the outside. It holds that inside stuff in, it holds that outside stuff out. But it does a lot more than that. So what else does it do? Well, we just said that it holds stuff in or out. It is a mechanical barrier. It is a wall. It's not a cell wall, but it is a wall. So it's holding stuff in or out of the cell. But sometimes things outside the cell need to be able to get in, or things inside the cell need to be able to get out, like those cellular secretions we just mentioned. So not a full solid wall. Some things can pass, and we don't want everything to pass, so there has to be a way that this membrane can dictate what does or does not get through. We say it provides selective permeability. Selective permeability. That means that it is a barrier, but it can determine selectively what gets through and what does not get through. Next, it produces an electrochemical gradient. That's going to be a really, really important topic later when we get to electric conductive tissues like muscles and nerves. Gradient just means there's more of something in one area than another. That's all that means. There's more of something in one area than another. An electrical gradient means there's more of a charge in one area than another. Maybe there's more positives here, there's more negatives here. A chemical gradient means that there is more of a substance in one area than another. Maybe out here there's a lot of sodium, and in here there's not a lot of sodium. Or maybe out here there's a lot of glucose, and in here there's not a lot of glucose. Those are chemical gradients. Electrochemical gradients is a way of combining those two things. Maybe there's more sodium with a positive charge outside the cell, and there's less sodium with a positive charge inside the cell. There's a chemical gradient, more sodium outside than inside. There's an electrical gradient, more positives outside than inside. Together, there is an electrochemical gradient. Now, even though those gradients that I was just saying are not important just yet, they are true. And they are going to come back as a big topic when we get to those electrically conductive tissues. So, everything that I just said, not important just yet, but will be soon. Communication. Well, we said cells are kind of joined together for the most part. And those neighboring cells communicate with each other. And that's extremely important that they communicate with each other. One cell joined to another cell, stuff will pass back and forth between them. That's really how your heart works. The way electric passes through your heart to cause it to beat, that's because those heart cells are joined together and stuff is passing between them. Cell to cell communication. But cells need to be able to communicate with cells way off in other parts of your body. There's something in your brain called the pituitary gland that is in regular communication with something sitting on top of your kidneys in your lower back called the adrenal glands. They're not physically connected to each other. So cells in your pituitary gland in your brain will release chemical signals that travel in your bloodstream to your adrenal glands in your lower back. That's cell signaling. Another type of cell-to-cell communication is just long distance. So if we look at this diagram of the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, we can tell it's made of a lot of different parts. Most of them are these little tadpole-looking guys. There's like a head with two little tails sticking off of it. Or here it is in the other direction, a head with two little tails sticking off of it. That should look familiar. That's what we saw at the end of chapter 2 when we talked about phospholipids. Phospholipids have a head and two tails. The head is the phosphate group. The tails are the fatty acids. The head is polar, the tails are nonpolar. Think back to chapter 2. Something that's polar, we could also say is hydrophilic. It likes water. The nonpolar tails, well, something that's nonpolar doesn't like water. We say it's hydrophobic. So the structure determines the orientation, the way that they're laid out. Think back to what the body's made of. What is most of the body? What's the thing that the body is made of the most? Water. Depending on your age, it's maybe more, maybe less, but it's always going to be mostly water. Outside the cells, watery environment. Mostly water out here. Inside the cells, mostly water, watery environment. Well, if there's water outside the cell and heads are attracted to it because they are hydrophilic, because they are polar, well, the heads are going to point outward and the tails are going to point inward. Fat doesn't like water, so the tails are going to point away from the water outside the cell. The problem there is inside the cell is water too. So we have to have the heads facing inward with the tails pointing outward. But we can't have the heads pointing outward and the tails pointing inward. Or we can't have the heads pointing inward and the tails pointing outward. Either way, there's water. So what happens naturally is the plasma membrane forms a two-layer structure called a phospholipid bilayer. B-I-L-A-Y-E-R. Bilayer. It means two-layered. A phospholipid bilayer means there's two layers made of phospholipids. Heads on the outside and the inside of the cell because there's water in both places. Tails are sandwiched in between, hidden away from the water. Think of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The heads are the bread. The tails are the peanut butter and the jelly. That's most of what the plasma membrane is made of. That's most of what the fluid mosaic model is. But let's go back and look at this word, fluid mosaic. Now that we know the major building block, this kind of saying here, fluid mosaic, is going to become important. Fluid, most of us know that word. It's liquid. It's something that flows. It's something that moves around. Water is a fluid. Air is a fluid. It moves around. It doesn't just stay in one place. But what's a mosaic? Some of us have heard this word. A mosaic is a type of art. If you stand back and you look at it, it looks like a picture, maybe a photograph or a painting. But if you get really, really close, it's actually tiny little squares or pieces of something stuck together. When you look at it up close, it's little pieces. When you look at it from far away, it takes on an image. Well, the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, is like that. It's fluid. All of these things that make up the plasma membrane that we're going to learn, they move around. If this were a photograph of the plasma membrane, if we took the same photograph 10 minutes later, everything in here would be in a different position. The things move around. It's fluid. But it is a mosaic because it's made of lots and lots and lots of different individual pieces. And all of those pieces move around independently of each other. Later on, maybe this big purple guy right here, it's a protein. Maybe this will be way over here, and maybe one of these small proteins here will be over here. They move around. They are a fluid mosaic. Most of what it's made of are phospholipids. But there are other lipids that make up this membrane. For example, there are something called glycolipids. Anytime we see glyco, it means sugar or starch or something carbohydrate based. That's what these green guys are. And these green guys are a starch. They are a bunch of glucose molecules strung together. But the lipid part refers to these fatty acid tails. Instead of having a polar head group, some of them are attached to one of these starch chains. We could see that green here is attached to two of those fatty acid tails. The fatty acid tails keeps it holding on to the membrane here. But sticking up into the extracellular space is this chain of carbohydrates. This is a glycolipid. And glycolipids are there to kind of hold on to things. It anchors the cell in place. It will either hold on to proteins that are out here in the extracellular space, or maybe it's grabbing on to a glycolipid sticking off from another cell. They hold on to each other, they hold on to the surrounding environment. Glycolipids. Next, we have cholesterol. And cholesterol gets a bad rap. Every time we see cholesterol in the news or in a magazine or something, it's talking about how bad it is for you. Well, cholesterol is important, and if we didn't have cholesterol, we would all be dead. Cholesterol does a bunch of things in our body. Right now, we're talking about what does it do to the cell membrane? And these kind of yellow or orange guys here, these are molecules of cholesterol. Cholesterol is embedded in the plasma membrane, and it is there to reduce the fluidity, especially at low temperature. But it reduces the fluidity. We don't want the plasma membrane to be so fluid that nothing stays in place long enough to do something. We don't want it to be so runny that it runs away from the cell. We want it to have fluidity, but not pure fluidity. Cholesterol helps with that. But there are other things in the plasma membrane. we can see all these purple guys. These purple guys are different types of proteins. So let's look at the membrane proteins of the fluid mosaic. There's two types. There are integral membrane proteins and peripheral membrane proteins. Integral can have two meanings. Maybe it starts on one side, goes all the way through the membrane, and comes out the other side, like we see up here at the top, or like we see here in the middle. These are integral membrane proteins. Some integral membrane proteins that I don't think we see here. Let's see. Here is another integral membrane protein. It starts on one side, it goes in, but it does not come out the other side. So both cases, integral membrane proteins penetrate the plasma membrane to some degree. The other, peripheral membrane proteins, set on the periphery of the membrane, like we see right here. This is a peripheral protein. It sits on one side. Here is another one. It sits on one side. They are both peripheral membrane proteins because they do not penetrate. They are not integrated into the plasma membrane. They sit on the periphery of the membrane. And like we saw back in chapter 2, proteins do everything. There are so many different roles of proteins in the body. They are by far the most diverse molecule in the body. They can do practically any job you can think of. In the plasma membrane, they have some very important functions. One, transport. I've said a few times now that some things do need to be able to cross from inside the cell to out, or outside the cell to in. When that happens, membrane proteins are almost always responsible. Next, receptors. Remember I said that something in your brain might need to talk to something in your lower back? One way it can do that is by sending chemical signals. And when those chemicals get to the cell that they need to talk to, they're going to do that by binding to a protein. When a signal binds to a protein, it causes a change that affects something inside the cell. Next, attachment to the cytoskeleton and the extracellular matrix. Just like we said with the glycolipids, well, proteins and glycoproteins both will do that. So proteins can also grab onto things outside the cell, the extracellular matrix, grab onto things inside the cell, proteins called the cytoskeleton, and it holds that cell in place. Next, enzymes. Remember from chapter 2, an enzyme is something that is a protein and a catalyst. It is a protein that causes a reaction to happen faster than it would on its own. Some of those enzymes are a part of the cell membrane. Intracellular joining. Here we have plasma membrane from cell 1, plasma membrane from cell 2, and the proteins that are in cell 1 are grabbing on to the proteins that are in cell 2. So these, sometimes they're called cell adhesion molecules, or CAM. I don't really like to use that term too much. You might hear it later, but just one cell holding on to another cell, intracellular joining. Very similar to what we saw up here. Next, cell-to-cell recognition. These are extremely important and a big part of how our immune system works. Here we have a glycoprotein. It could just be a protein on its own, but another cell comes along and binds to it and recognizes it as, hey, you're supposed to be here, or hey, you're not supposed to be here, based on its shape. So here, one more term that we have is glycocalyx. And this kind of applies to what we're talking about now and what we talked about on the previous slide. Here we have glycoproteins, proteins that have pieces of starch or glucose, carbohydrates sticking up out of the cell. We have the same thing over here with glycolipids. But if we look at a cell, across the top, the outside edge, I guess top isn't really the right word, but the outside edge of the cell is coated in all these different types of carbohydrate chains. Outside the cell, the surface is coated in lots of carbohydrates. And all of those carbohydrates of every type together are called the glycocalyx. That literally means sugar coat. Your cells are sugar coated, and the glycocalyx is what that sugar coat is. Now, lastly, we are going to look at how cells are joined to neighboring cells. And there's different ways depending on how those cells need to be joined to each other. There's different types of cell junctions. Here we have just kind of an imaginary set of cells showing us the different ways that cells can be joined together. First, demonstrated right here, zoom in, we get down here. This is called a tight junction. One plasma membrane and the next plasma membrane are joined very, very tightly together by proteins. And they are so tightly together that really nothing can get in between these cells. Nothing can get in between these cells because of the tight junctions. We find this, one good example, is along our digestive tract. We don't want the stuff passing through our digestive tract that's full of digestive enzymes and acid to be able to get in between the cells and leak out the other side so that it digests us. We don't want that. So we have these tight junctions to prevent things from getting in between the cells. Next, we have something called desmosomes, or sometimes they're called anchoring junctions. Very similar to tight junctions. These are very strong, except they're not so tight together. There's a little bit of space in between. I like to tell people, think of if you've ever been on a boat and you pull up to the dock, what do? You throw the rope over to the dock, you tie it off to the dock. The boat's not going to go anywhere. It's held tightly in place. But the boat is free to move around. That's how desmosomes work. One cell and the other cell, they're held very tightly together by these cadherins, these proteins. They're held very tightly together, but they can move a little bit independently of each other. This is how your heart muscle cells are joined together. When the heart contracts, these cells pull in opposite directions. We don't want them to pull apart from each other. Desmosomes help hold them together. But we do need the cells to be able to move a little bit, so desmosomes allow that. Next, we have gap junctions. Gap junctions are not there to hold cells together. Gap junctions are there to allow stuff in one cell to move through a tunnel into another cell that's nearby. So two cells that are connected by gap junctions will have things passing back and forth between them. Another example here is also the heart. Electrical ions that are in one heart cell will move through a gap junction into another cell. This allows the electricity during a heartbeat to pass very, very efficiently from one heart cell to the next. When we get to chapter 4 and we talk about cardiac muscle, heart muscle cells, remember desmosomes and gap junctions because we're going to look at them again when we get there. All right, so that is the end of this first lecture of Chapter 3. Please make sure to listen to it a time or two. If you didn't get it all the first time, if something didn't make sense, please be sure to reach out with questions if you have them. Make sure you do understand everything here, because the rest of this chapter and a lot in future chapters is really, really going to depend on understanding it. All right, I hope you had enjoyed it. We're going to continue talking about more living things from this point forward. I personally think that things are a lot more interesting now that we've gotten past Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. I hope you feel the same way. But like I said, reach out, let me know any questions or concerns that you have, and I will see you in our next lecture.